role will be to just briefly introduce the report, and I'll be mindful of how long this wee kōrero is, as I'm keen to move the report, so we'll have the chance to do an intro then too. So as you're aware, I'm sure from reading the report, and as you know, because it was those of us sitting around this table that last July passed 3 resolutions, and those were to adopt the Climate Emergency Action Framework, to request the development of a climate change update report to be presented back for adoption before the end of this financial year, hence the paper we've got in front of us today, and also to agree that this process of delivering a report back to us will be annual. So we'd just like to thank Brandy, Ninka, and also the wider kind of council team for inputting into what is a very comprehensive stock take of where we currently are at, and also thank the comms team for the work that they've done and will continue to do to find creative ways of communicating our journey to carbon neutrality and beyond to our community, both at a district-wide level and also within the organisation, also the mahi we're doing in the adaptation space. So the purpose of the report, which is outlined through the report itself, is to summarise climate action that we have already agreed for the 3 years of the current long-term plan, and also to highlight special projects that are underway or planned within the next 3 years, and report also on completed climate actions as of recent. So hopefully you're all very much aware now of the importance of us taking climate action, and it's been cool to see councillors really come to the table and supporting the work that we've done to date, and hopefully continue to do more. And hopefully you're all aware too of how intersectional this work needs to be, working across teams, so that there isn't any kind of unintended consequences of mahi that's being done, but also that we're capitalising on opportunities to reduce emissions across all sectors of council and all areas of investment and work. So as you get a sense from the report, infrastructure is kind of a predominant area through which we have huge opportunities to reduce emissions, but also an area that, if we don't take seriously enough, can have impacts in the other direction, and also strategy and growth. So that's another area that I'd just like to highlight. It's also great to see through the report, and want to acknowledge the work in partnership with our iwi partners, mana whenua, and awesome to see how that relationship has continued to be strengthened through an area of work which is so important, and that our Indigenous whānau have so much mātauranga to contribute to really enhance our solutions. So essentially the scene has been set for us to ramp up climate mahi since and even before 2019, and then also last year when we, as mentioned, adopted the Climate Emergency Action Framework in 2019, when a climate emergency declaration was declared by the previous council. We've got the strongest precedent we've ever had to do all we can to reduce emissions and adapt to the climate crisis. We continue to have a greater basis of science built for us that demonstrates the reality of the crisis. And I mean, we're seeing it at the moment with just how severe some of the weather has been over the last few days, and obviously with Takutai Kapiti launching into their work, and us being able to understand the impacts on the coast. So through this next stage of as we move into having a discussion about the report in front of us today, I would encourage councillors to ask the hard questions about how we can have more impact in both mitigation and adaptation, because what we've done and what we're doing to this point is great, but I still think there's so much more that can be done. So I would encourage you to use this opportunity to ask questions which might tease out those various things, and look forward to the discussion. And again, thanks staff for their work.
Thanks, Sophie. And I think we open it up for questions from here. Yeah, absolutely. So, Councillor McCann.
I don't know where I got this question from, Councillor. How can we have more impact?
Just noting the questions will be for staff. We're not. So, thank you.
Could I rephrase that? How can we have more impact? But from a staff perspective, imagine that there was unlimited budget. Imagine that the CE or whoever's in charge of you is not in the room. What are the things that we could do that we haven't started to consider yet, because maybe they're out of scope, or maybe the budgets are tight?
Just turn your volume off, Sean.
Through you, Mr. Chair. To be fair, we do an incredible amount, without a doubt. There are areas where we think we could potentially do more if we had budget. We recently have had some really good conversations with the
what?
Oh, that's right. We recently had some good conversations with the team that developed the growth strategy to talk about how we give effect to that principle related to low carbon capacity in the growth strategy. There are a lot of supports that we'd like to be able to provide to the resource consenting team and other teams to try and ensure that as capacity continues to grow, we give effect to some of these principles. There is definitely this, I wouldn't say challenge, but we have to be really mindful as we're thinking about intensification and some of the new central government mandates for development in certain areas that may not be on our main transport routes or may not currently have infrastructure. While it's really important that we consider developing in those areas, we know from the lobbying that we do with central and regional government, it can be really hard to bring the public transport infrastructures and things like that we need. So there's always work that we can do in that area, and a lot of it is happening, but we could do more. And for that, I'm talking about the time that it takes to review the LMDR and whatnot. And there's also, I think, if we had the budget, more that we could do with supporting the community. In the last LTP, we've continued to reduce funding for number 8 wire programs and those types of supports that we provide. And that has to do with budget and where we want to put our energy.
Councillor McCann.
Thank you. That's a really good answer. And just to follow up with two areas, we need to continue to take the community with us, and we also need to continue to take staff with us, because there are competing priorities within council. How do you see in the future that we continue to take the community with us?
Kia ora, everybody. So, yeah. I think in the future, we've always, when we embarked on this journey with this new team and 2 staff to support me basically and the team going forward doing something on climate change, that this LTP was always going to be the first step up, trying to get a program together, do the first steps of upskilling, getting ourselves ready across council embedding, and that's basically the result of what we have done is in this report. And as Brandy said, it's quite a lot, but it was always clear that LTP 2024, also based on our conversations with the Auditor General's office, that would be the LTP where you actually have to get full frontage when it comes to climate change and how you do these things and how you are prepared. And that will also be a conversation in that audit. So it was always a 2-step process. Basically, this LTP is the step up to the next LTP. And as far as competing things that we have to deal with at the moment, a lot is happening, as we know. A lot of changes coming to this council all at the same time. And we're trying to stay afloat. And we do quite well because we have relationships across all council's activities. So we have been involved, as Brandy mentioned, in the growth strategy. We're working with the ED team. We're doing what we can to be part of every single conversation that will have to have those considerations as part of decision making. So whether it's housing or it's the environment or the way we do resource consenting for land use planning, all these things we are into. But yes, there's so many hours in a day and there's so much staff available to do these things. So yes, I would love to have a team of 15 people like they do in Wellington City. That makes life a lot easier.
I'm sure the CE has just heard a team of 15 people. Thank you very much for those answers.
Your Worship, the Mayor.
This is my constant arm wrestling with the portfolio holder, Councillor McCann. Let me go back to the previous paper on economic development in the Kotahitanga Board. They made a measurement that I think is interesting to frame my question. They looked at consumption spend was gone up by 7.4%, but they rationalized that by also saying that the inflation rate has actually gone up by 6.9%. So you cannot use the 7% really because it's been eroded. Given that, on your agenda page 21, you've got 11 hectares of trees being planted at the Waikana Dam land side. On page 22, you talk about further planting on council land. While we are increasing that, there is also the counterbalance or counterfactual to that, because increased urbanization will mean, and it's already starting to happen, where trees have been cut down. In Auckland, I know there have been issues raised in terms of dramatic and colorful description of chainsaw massacre of trees. What methodology do we have to measure this? I'm not saying that we have the ability to change it, but at least we should know what is the cost of development from a climate change factor. That's my first question.
Through you, Mr. Chair. Two aspects of that. When we think about the ability to count carbon sequestration in trees in terms of the annual auditing that we do, the way that it's designed through the central government system is you have to have tree stands of a certain size. So actually trees that are on small, like maybe one lot, would not be counted in our reporting. So cutting them down also means that in our reporting we would not be losing anything. That being said, all trees and grasses do help to sequester. So every time we cut down a tree, and even more importantly for Kapiti, every time we dig up peat to build on a lot, we are releasing carbon dioxide and other gases into the atmosphere. So we are increasing our emissions, even though we're not accounting for them anywhere. And we don't actually have any way or any requirements. So we absolutely underestimate the cost of development in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. But there are no national guidelines that we can turn to help us in that regard. So, yeah.
So suppose in the RMA language it's called cumulative effects. My second observation really, I'm looking at the adaptation introduction. I think it's a little weak. I think the adaptation side, the changes are significant. It is the quantity of the significance that's been debated. But this introduction doesn't actually show clearly the huge danger that we are facing and is already starting to happen. I would suggest with Sophie's support that we need to strengthen this. When I introduced the climate change resolution, much of it was based on the fact of the huge cost for a start on the adaptation side. I just want to emphasize that. I think it's important. That's all, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Deputy Mayor Holborough.
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair. So my first question has been answered in part, but I just want to give it an extra relevance. So it's not in this paper, but on page 101 of our agendas, under challenges, under our quarterly report, under sustainability and resilience, it says that our 2025 carbon neutral goal is unlikely to be reached and we need to review it. Now, I was on the council when we moved that, and the idea was that it was an aspirational goal, but that we would be doing, and on the same day we declared a climate emergency, the idea of that very short-term goal was that we pull out all the stops and we pull all the levers in terms of our climate change response. Do you think we're doing that?
So just before I come to you, because I think we have covered this in a briefing a little bit around not meeting that target and the reasons behind that, but I'll hand it over to.
Yes, through you, Mr. Chair. Yes, in February I briefed the council about that it wasn't very likely we're going to meet that target. We also discussed how it was set as an aspirational target, so I think we're all aware of that. But in the light of debating and reviewing it, it is going to come later, earlier next year, because we decided in that briefing that we were going to have a few more feasibility studies done before we could literally make the decision which steps would get us the furthest, before we then see what the time frame would have to be for this target to review it. But at the moment, when the climate change emergency was declared, we were in LTP 2018, and that was a different time, to be fair. It just had less emphasis. So we had 2 more years to go when that happened before we got into the current LTP, where the emphasis is definitely lifted to another level, but still competes with other really big issues that this council tackles. So in the sense, yes, you could always do more, but it is also a matter of affordability and other priorities this council is also pursuing.
Then can just clarify for me as well, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, there was also the change in measurements or targets that meant, and then we obviously had a discussion as a council around the certificates and other approaches in terms of which we debated, discussed and discounted.
So the big change with the target and the presentation that led to our climate change emergency declaration and the target, it was based on our emission journey we were on at that moment in time, which excluded our emissions from wastewater treatment. And since then, we've had to add that, which basically means that our footprint from our services has gone up because we now need to account for that. So that in itself would also bring the timeline further out. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks. I think that's really useful to have on the record today. And it certainly sounds like our response is certainly doing everything we can within what we think is affordable. So that's fantastic. The Mayor had one comment around adaptation on the report, and with your leave, I could do that now rather than, even though it's not a question.
Yeah, and I think you had one around the Takatai as well from memory, so maybe both.
That's the one I'm referring to.
Okay.
So, so in the report, under adaptation, right at the end, it has a section on Takudai Kapiti, our coastal adaptation project. It's page 48 of the agenda, page 39. So I just wonder if that shouldn't be moved, it shouldn't be, maybe not for this report, but for future reports further up, because the idea is that we're community-led, not that that's some kind of response, so that it's clear that the actions that we're taking in the future will be a result of the work of the Takutai panel, particularly as they strengthen and the results start to come out. So it's maybe for the next report, but just, and there's no kind of heading on it, so it's just kind of in a box. I wonder if it just could be strengthened a wee bit. They're doing absolutely fantastic.
I think your wording in our pre-meeting, which made sense to me, was it's almost like that's just a separate thing. It's in its own little box with its own little heading, and it kind of needs to be part of the whole approach rather than, and it's obviously not the intention, but could be how it's seen was sort of what you touched on.
Mr. Chair, that helps.
Okay. Thank you, Janet. Sophie, did you have some questions?
Yes, just a couple of questions. So the first one, through the annual plan discussion, Councillor Compton and I brought up the idea of a climate action targeted rate, similar to what Auckland City Council have introduced. So just wondering whether, from your perspective, with some of those constraints that you've identified in answering questions from fellow councillors, whether something like that you think would give us kind of more room to take those actions which currently we don't have the resource to take?
Yes, so I've read the decision that was made in Auckland yesterday, and Howley is highly focused on capital investment in their transport sector with sort of earmarked projects. I think the approach we have taken now in the last 2 years is to embed climate change decision making as part of all our activity decision making. So as such, rates are already connected to that decision making as part of the rates that fund that certain activity. So I'm I'm not too sure how that approach would work, and I haven't been part of further discussions than providing you with this feedback on what we currently do.
I'm just going to go to His Worship the Mayor because he's giving me the look that he wants to add something to that. And is Mary, he can do that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, with your indulgence. In the area of coastal hazard, and given the panel is now looking into this, there are already ideas in terms of targeted rating on coastal properties for protection. So, how many targeted ratings can you do on the climate change?
Thank you,
It's
Gary.
better to be targeted than widely targeted.
Thank you, Your Worship. So, Sophie, I guess what I'm hearing from that is there probably needs to be a broader discussion around the merits of that, not to saying that it isn't warranted. And I guess something I was going to say to you, Ninka, was around if you were to have a rate, and I think previous discussions was what would you spend it on? Do you have the resources to, you wouldn't target it without having projects in mind and so forth. So not discounting what you've raised, Sophie, but I think, I guess the question that I would raise to help Sophie's discussion was, when's the right time to have that discussion and how much lead-in do you need to land that discussion? Because as an elected member, and I might be around next training, but if say Sophie, for example, wanted to bring that to the table, it would be quite discouraging to hear that there's not enough time to discuss it. It should have been brought up earlier. So do we have anyone in the room that wants to respond to, I guess, Sophie's question and my sort of part response around that? Mr. De Haast, thank you.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, everyone. So, look, I think just to summarise what's already been said. So, we already have budget to do quite a lot of work. This council is already doing that, and that's flowing through our current rating system. So, for those of you that have been around the table for many years, you know that we've spent a lot of time actually simplifying our rating system. So, rates are a blunt tool, and when you start to get into the realms, I do echo what the Mayor was saying. When you start to get into the realms of targeted rates, there's actually quite a lot of restrictions on your targeted rates. So it's six in one, half a dozen in the other. Yes, you can create a special targeted rate. That's just going to be essentially it's going to reflect the budget that you put in to do that work. We already have that. We don't have a specific targeted rate. We didn't see the need to go out and consult on the rating system. We typically do that as part of the rating system review. But we have spent the best part of 6 years actually simplifying our rating system, because when you look at ours compared to everyone else's, it's way complex, and you do get into the debate of targeted versus district-wide. So for now, we've got budget. You have given the nod to budget, which is included in the long-term plan. That's flowed through the draft annual plan that you need to adopt. The rating system is rating for that accordingly. So at this stage, and it is a wider conversation, and it's something that you would probably seek to do as part of the next long-term plan. If you want it specific, of course we can do that, but then you're in the realms of consultation.
Thank you, Mark. And I guess as we're leading into a new training, it's probably a good discussion, Sophie, for the incoming council as they look to set their priorities and goals and so forth. So did you have any further questions, Sophie? All right, thank you. We've got Councillor Compton.
Thank you. Through the chair, we know that targets are really brilliant for focusing our efforts, and we've seen the progress that council has made towards becoming a net carbon neutral organisation by 2025. But we're sort of lacking a target for a broader district, aren't we? We don't have anything for the Kapiti Coast as a whole, and I note that Wellington City is light years ahead of us on this. They're taking part in things like the Cities Race to Zero initiative, which is a collection of cities around the world that are trying to race to be the first to being carbon neutral. And Wellington City actually has a goal of being the first city in Aotearoa to be net carbon neutral as well. So is that a missing part of our puzzle, to have a goal like Kapiti being net carbon neutral by 2040 or something? Give us a real ambitious goal for the district as a whole that informs not only the investment decisions that this council makes, but we can use it to inform and influence the investment decisions that the regional council and central government makes.
Yes, district-wide emissions were discussed at this table, I believe, when we were going through the L2P as well. And we are very aware that Auckland and Christchurch and Wellington, so very large entities compared to Kapiti have a district-wide emissions goal or a city-wide one. They also have a large workforce who helps them implement this. And in the current LTP, our main focus for year one was let's carry on with what we have to do against our target. And next year, our small step forwards working with the community on district-wide emissions, behavior change, is a carbon educator that will come and move into my team, and hopefully I can recruit that person in the next couple of months. So that's baby steps towards working with the community, delivering in the community, targeting district-wide emissions, because those emissions are highly related to behavior change. Almost none of these emissions is under direct control of this council, because we don't deliver public transport. We get a portion of people that travel on our highways, but we cannot pluck people out of cars to drive less through our district if we have State Highway 1 through our district.
In fairness, Wellington City Council doesn't provide public transport, and they've said this.
Councillor, can we just let staff finish and then we'll come
Well,
back?
it's so you have to consider that district-wide emissions, a lot of it is we can help and support and advocate and drive behavior change and enable, because we are enabling, for instance, by bearing all these fabulous shared footpath cycleways. We've established ourselves as a district that attracts people that come and ride their bikes here. So you can enable as far as that's in your own sort of realm of control and services delivery, and drive climate change, behavior change. So what we're doing, for example, under the Regional Wellington Growth Framework, is a regional reduction plan. And we sat around as officers from the different councils and said that will be our main focus, is a big behavior change program. But it would be good to do that at a regional level to really create that across region visibility that you would need to change these things. So I guess we're at the moment here, we're just doing a little baby step, and probably in LTP 24, there can be a discussion about a target for district-wide emissions, if we feel confident that we can actually deliver in that space.
I've got Brandy wants to respond, and then I think I've got Sean Gwynn, and then I'll come back to you.
Sean first.
Okay, Sean. Good morning.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've had a couple of responses, or a response to the question of funding, I guess. This issue is not one that just requires a whole lot of extra money poured into that activity area, and we'll hear later today about the issues around resourcing and delivery, and I think the team are actually pulling together, as Nick has mentioned, the outcome from some feasibility work that will help inform where best to direct additional funding in terms of our target for 2025. But the other question Councillor Compton raised around the district, we are currently looking at that issue and what we can do maybe from a policy perspective to help try and look wider than just the council in terms of its emission reduction, which is where the focus has been primarily. And that work is actually happening at the moment. So we will be coming back in advance of, I guess, the LTP process, which might seem like a long way away, but isn't that far away, with some further work around the district's emission and how might we get to that sort of zero carbon Kapiti target.
Thanks for that, Sean. And we can see the wind still quite wild out there in the background. Appreciate you chipping in. Brandy, I think you wanted to add something, and then we'll come back to Councillor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to briefly, Ninka and Sean have covered it, but I did want to say we've been watching what many other councils in the country are doing for this kind of district-wide or city-wide emissions reductions. And there are a lot of different ways that they're going about it. And I agree with what Sean is saying. If we want to move in this direction, I think it requires a lot of thought. So, for example, in Nelson, Tasman, what they have done is something similar to what our Connected Communities team is doing, where they have to try and drive behavior change in their community. They've invested more heavily in their nonprofits that do this kind of work. They're trying to get their community to lead the behavior change. Wellington City Council, as Ninka mentioned, is heavily investing in some of the best communications minds that they can find in the country to really think about behavior change. And we've certainly talked about these kind of things internally. For example, in Kapiti, we have built a really great CWB system. There might be some areas where we're making a few tweaks and improvements, but we've started to build the network. How do we get people to use it? So it is about behavior change, and this is hard. And we attend these national local government climate change working groups where people talk about behavior change. So there are a lot of ideas out there, but I do think, going back to what Sean is saying, if we want to go in this path, it will not be helpful if we just set a target without developing what is our preferred approach to make it. How are we going to support it, and how are we going to try and make this happen, either through council or through, other people that can help drive community behavior change. So I just wanted to throw that in. If we just develop a target without a plan, we might not be very successful.
Thanks, Brandy. Quite a fulsome answer there from the three staff.
Just drawing on my own experience in change communications, having big, hairy, audacious goals does help galvanise behaviour change. So I'd challenge the idea that you can set the goal and get the plan to implement it, and that's actually what we've seen other councils do. But I've got a follow-up question, and it's picking up on the Mayor's earlier question about urban intensification. Now, is it our understanding as a council, given that we control essentially the form that urban areas take within our district, is it our understanding that urban sprawl, which has been the norm for Aotearoa now for 40-odd years in terms of development, well, we've protected the amenity of existing privileged areas, that's led to far more intense, carbon-intense lifestyles, given the reliance on individual fossil fuel-powered car transport, than would have otherwise been the case had we focused on urban intensification around public transport nodes. Is that our understanding of how that sort of debate plays out?
I think that's a significant part of it. Wouldn't necessarily, while building of the expressways has also been great in that they provide resilience and other opportunities for transport, we can see, like we mentioned in the report, that we have had an increase in per capita use of per capita transport emissions. Yeah. So whether that's because people don't live close enough or we make it easier for them to stay in their cars, it's hard to know.
The Infrastructure Commission put out a good report last month which explicitly said that it was urban development choices by councils that have led to the transport networks that we've got. So.
Wow. Yeah.
Thank you, Graham. I would probably just add there that I thought we did debate as a council having a district-wide goal when we went through the workshopping processes. And so we discussed and debated that. Not to say that it shouldn't be discussed again, and I thank councillors for bringing those questions to the table, but it's not like we didn't have a robust discussion around that and focus on the areas where we thought we could make the biggest difference. So, Councillor Halliday.
Through you, Mr Chair. I just got a couple of questions, not broad ones, they're actually quite specific to the report, just some information I would like, if that's all right. Page 21, 22 talks to expanding to solar feasibility studies.
Can we just appreciate you raising the page number? That's really helpful. Just in terms of the actual report or the council paper, 21, 22.
The council paper. The agenda. Bottom of the page. Identify opportunities for further emissions reductions across council. I looked to talk to about the expand on 2 solar feasibility studies, and I was just wondering, does that sort of, I know there was some conversation around potentially looking at solar farm up Otaki Way sort of scenario there. So I just wondering if you could expand on that a little bit.
Yep, that is exactly what that refers to.
Okay,
it follows from the briefing to council in February in our conversations to do a further feasibility to look at renewable energy generation, either in a farm or in a civic hub. Yeah.
And that's in partnership with Energize Otaki, is it? Or I suppose that's a potential partner, I guess, maybe. But,
yes, but I mean, we were just talking the feasibility of it first.
That's great. I don't have a page number for this one, but through the adaptation, it talked to a very big risk being potable water supply. I'm just curious, is there any consideration, or should we be putting any consideration towards a dam being a realistic approach as part of the solution here? I mean that in regards to the collection of, we don't have a water problem, we have just a water storage problem on the Kapiti coast. We've got plenty of it, as we can see today, plenty of it coming down. Is that something that's being considered at all?
Over to you, Sean.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So Councillor, there is a proposal to construct a dam as part of our sort of 100-year water supply strategy. So Council procured land 2012, 2013 for a dam that would be commissioned at the time when we exceed our available take consent for the Waikanae River catchment and for the river recharge scheme. So is that's what you're referring to? So we do have that as a proposal. We do have significant storage within the network at the moment. The dam provides us with access to potable supply, or to source water, basically for the next 100 years.
Yep, that's cool, as long as it's in the mix. That's fantastic. The only other question I had was around the report, by the way, is fantastic. I've really enjoyed reading it. In the context of it being an annual report, is this the best time to land this report with regards to the information flow through, if you like? This is just before the end of our financial year. Would this be perhaps more appropriate, once we've got our financial year sorted, to be actually coming back to us maybe a month and a half after the end of the financial year? I'm just curious more than anything else whether we need to be looking at the time frame that this report comes, that it's actually capturing the right information.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I'm not certain that I can entirely answer that question. I'm not sure if you're implying that it would feed into the decisions that you made, or the decisions that you've recently made in an annual plan.
Look, I just, sorry.
I think we'll park that and the staff can take that away and just consider it. Thanks.
No,
I understand. No, that's okay.
No, that's fair enough.
Thanks, Martin.
That's all I wanted to do.
Councillor Pravanov.
Thank you, through you, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much for the report today. Really interesting and very good. Just my very first comment is, it doesn't actually have a date on it at this point in time. That's my easy question or comment. The second, I suppose, point that I was going to raise, but it was actually raised by the Mayor, and that relates to the planting of 11 hectares of trees, and it's really interesting to hear that with urban intensification that a lot of vegetation is going to be removed, or reduced, but that's not going to be included in any credits that we potentially can be looking at here. But I suppose, and then there's been a conversation about urban sprawl, but that then leads me on to the transportation side, whereby intensification, and not urban sprawl actually is meant to help that. But on page 24, it talks about our sustainable transport strategy being met by 2035, where it's decarbonised, healthy, well-connected and accessible. But when you actually, and we're very reliant on GW for this, but when you look on the next page, on page 25, their targets are so much lower. How are we actually going to achieve the targets that we've set for our transport in that time frame when we're basically dealing with an outside organisation who doesn't have the same types of targets?
I'm going to hand that over to Glenn, I think. I'm getting a nod from the back there.
Yes,
thank you, Glenn.
Through you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Councillor. I think we touched on it a bit earlier in the meeting, and that's advocating, that's working with other agencies, Greater Wellington, that provides the public transport, making sure that we link in as much as we can. So things like public transport, is encouraged in possibly in your Waikanae ward. A recent example may be the extension of the bus services within the last 12 months up to cater a fairly big growth area in and around the Ryman's. That would be one example of what we'll do, and we'll continue to work on those sort of initiatives.
Thank you, Glenn. Any further, Jocelyn?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. But I realise it's probably going to be a hard job to do. So also too then, just going back to on page 15, and this has sort of been touched by Councillor Compton. So, this report is, very much around looking at our carbon neutrality for our organisation. And when you read the report, and it's everything's very highly interconnected, that some of the impacts that are discussed here are actually outside the organisation, and I think it probably would be quite useful to make that a bit clearer in terms of what the organisation itself is doing, and actually try and separate what is actually counted towards our carbon neutrality versus what we're trying to encourage our communities to do as well. To me, it's not clear, but whatever we can do to encourage reduced carbonisation is the best.
Thanks. Staff have noted that.
So then my other question relates to page 101 that says that we're possibly not going to meet the target by 2025.
In the quarterly report.
Yes. So then how far off are we? Because it doesn't actually, it talks about how much we've reduced our carbon emissions, but it doesn't actually talk about percentages, which I think is probably really important so we can get a real good idea. And I suppose the other part of that too is that obviously we've had to include the water waste emissions, and that's very recent, and if that's taken out, would we actually meet those targets by then, or would we still be way off?
So I'm happy for staff to just park that and note it in terms of the feedback, but if you do want to respond or have a response, then otherwise we'll move on.
I suppose I'm really quite interested in knowing how far off we're going to be off that target.
Yes, I briefed Council in February on this topic, and carbon neutrality means a whole lot more than just reducing your emissions, because basically we are an organisation that will never have zero emissions. That's impossible if you're a big service delivery and asset owner. So in addition to reducing as much as we can, and on that road we still have a few big steps to go, the solar feasibility is one of them. Once you have done all you can, and that's affordable for this council to reduce, then we're into the discussion of sequestration, which will involve further investment to plant forestry. And then we're into the remaining discussion of offsetting, yes or no, towards that neutral target. And that's still very much a discussion that's ongoing, I'd say.
Thanks, Ninka. And so that question and a few of the others have connections to the briefing in February. That presentation is on the LG Hub, so I just suggest to elected members to have a look back through that if you've got want to refresh your memory. Did you have anything further?
Yeah, I think though percentages, how that not coming meet is probably really quite.
All right. Quite useful. So we've got Councillor Elliott via Zoom. Good morning, Jackie. No, afternoon.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. I have a question just relating to a previous comment, although I realised if I ask the question it might breach some private confidentiality issues, so I'm going to word it a different way than ask a question.
Do you want to consider taking it offline? Would that be a more...
No, it's okay. I'm just going to comment to say that I would hope that any discussions about a solar farm in Otaki would be with Coastal Energy. The proposals look really, really good and robust, and that would be a really great addition, if not yet.
Thanks,
and
Jackie.
Secondly, I'm really curious about the wind farm proposal that came up for Pycock in the last few years.
Thanks, Jackie. Look, if I could clarify, because it's come up now twice, what I heard from staff was that they're doing work around the feasibility or the effectiveness of a solar farm. I imagine from there, once that information has been gathered, the next part of that project or stage would then be looking at whether council does it, whether it partners with someone, whether someone else does it. So I hope that was my understanding, and I see staff nodding. So the second question was around the solar and wind stuff. Do you want to respond to?
Wind farm, Pocock.
Over to you, Sean.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That proposal at the moment is still waiting on, I guess, landowner or land access issues with regard to obtaining a consent for the trust that's working on the proposal to progress that. And it's potentially advanced further with the Wainui Whenua, the decision from Greater Wellington Regional Council to invest in some support for looking at that piece of land that's surplus to Transmission Gully, the old Perkins farm. So it's tied into that in terms of getting access to the land. So that's sort of where it's sitting at the moment.
Thank you, Sean.
Thanks, Sean and Jackie. We're going to go to Councillor Buswell.
Thank you. We've just talked about 3 different entities in Kapiti that are looking at renewable energy projects. How do we know that they haven't already done a feasibility study that we can tap into or use to our benefit rather than reinventing the wheel and doing it all from scratch?
We have a high-level option because we commissioned those 2 reduction options reports, and as one of the high-level options, it was mentioned, here's an idea about a solar farm on paddock land council owns in Otaki, and it follows from our renewable energy certificate purchase discussion we had at that briefing as well. So it would help us to look at one of our biggest parts of our footprint is our energy use, so that's what that would work towards to. The other one was considering the roofs of all the buildings that we're in at the moment to create a solar hub here, which would be producing energy that you actually... So there are 2 different types of renewable energy. Either you produce it and you feed it into the grid and you get your offsets that way, or you actually use it during the daytime when you're here. For both of these concepts, no, we don't have the feasibility. We have it as a high option, and there were some numbers around it, but we actually need to get to the level of detail where we can assess for council if it's actually an affordable option, yes or no. So that's what that feasibility will give us.
Okay.
So they're not extensive studies, and we're definitely using the information we already have.
Okay.
For sure.
Okay,
yes,
that's good. Thank you.
Yes.
All right, I don't see any further, so I've just got a couple from me, and I'm assuming because this is a report, it'll be publicly available and possibly printed or whatever. Page 36 of the report itself, 45 of the council report. I wouldn't normally bring up little typo bits, but it's relating to the impression. It just says left. It should be right there.
Oh, yes. Thank you.
And I'm not sure whether that dog's supposed to be off leash.
Okay.
I'm just joking.
That's all right. Thank you.
Just
That's right.
looking at Mr. Jefferson down the back there, he's taking a close look. On a more serious note, because Sophie did challenge us at the start to ask, some bold questions around our response given the declaration. Just looking at the rise of sales in both electric and hybrid cars, and I might get it around the wrong way. I think we've seen a tripling in electric sales and a doubling in hybrid sales, or vice versa. Certainly seeing a lot more on the roads, and I went and test drove another electric car yesterday myself. What's the thinking around charge stations? Because I think we were ahead of the game in Kapiti with charge stations some years ago. Certainly in Otaki we were with the one put in by Energize. But I guess my fear is, as we see quite a rapid uptake due to increased fuel costs and so forth of EV and hybrid ownerships, we might not see the infrastructure there to support it.
Yes, so we were part of a project about 5 years ago together with Horfenu and Electra, so that's how we have some chargers in public spaces at the moment. We do get approached. We have an offer of one big provider who's also wanting to put more public spaces, public chargers in our public space, but we are also at a point where we probably need to develop some kind of a policy around it, because more providers are knocking on our doors and say, you're the road controlling authority, surely you can give me a few parking spaces and access to your electricity network to do this. But I do feel we need a more transparent approach than just working with the person that comes along or the company that comes along. So we have to debate that at the moment with the Growth and Strategy Group, to sit in one room and not out a bit of a policy. How are we going to work with those approaches? And with the Economic Development team on where do we have parks that are best suited to provide this? But yeah, it is in the pipeline. We have an offer on the table, let's put it that way, and we're working with these people. So maybe we will have those, we will still progress that one to not make them lose interest. But it is a wider discussion, and it feeds toward our district-wide emissions discussion the same.
Yeah, and I guess raising the comment because I'd like to know that we're sort of at least ahead of the curve or with the curve rather than lagging behind. So
we're not lagging behind.
Yeah, sure.
No.
As a side comment to that, it'd be really interesting to see if anyone's done any economic studies around that, because there's a lot of chatter around the financial spend for people parking, waiting for charges and spending locally. And I don't know if anyone's actually done a study nationwide, but I'd imagine that it would show strong economic benefits from charge stations in specific areas. That's certainly what I'm hearing anyway. So with that, I think that's the end of questions. And we're sitting at 12:15, just to remind everyone of where we are in the day and quite a bit more on the agenda to go. So Councillor Henford, are you wanting to move the recommendations in a nice succinct introduction, and then we'll move through and seconding and so forth?
Yeah, cool. Kia ora, Mr. Chair. I'll keep it really succinct. So,
sorry, Sophie. I just need my bad. I should have just looked for a seconder. So, Janet has seconded. So, right of introduction. Oh,
awesome. Yeah, I'll try and keep this as succinct as possible. Again, just thanking the team for the awesome report that's in front of us, and the depth and breadth of information that's held within it. And I think what kind of the questioning has really showed is that if through kind of upcoming reports, and maybe this is a conversation I can have with staff offline, is whether there's the opportunity to identify some of those gaps and where we might be kind of placed in terms of our kōrero in relation to them. So for example, the district-wide emissions target. And as Sean mentioned, if there's some work being done in that space in regards to setting us up well for the next long-term plan, that's great and really good news. And, you know, in terms of how we can expand our CWB network, involve more budget in the education and community involvement space, and yeah, all of those various things, it would be cool to, through the report, be aware of those gaps so the community is too. And again, just would really like to acknowledge our iwi partners in a lot of this mahi, especially in the stormwater space, and that was identified quite clearly through the report, and looking forward to continuing alongside them in this journey to protect Te Taiao and take actions to reduce emissions. And to kind of tag onto that as well, would just like to thank Councillor Compton for the questions around the district-wide target, because I really think that's kind of where we're looking to next, in my view, as an exciting next step, considering, as has been mentioned by staff, we're doing a lot internally, and I don't doubt that for a second, and trying to honour that through even challenging us to go further and faster. It's not it's in no way a disrespect to everything that we are doing, because all of that stuff is really important. So yeah, great to see where we're at, great to see where we have to go. And I would encourage us all to think about the fact that what we do does matter. I know I've heard from some councillors that they feel like, well, we're just a small district, or some people in our community will say, you know, we have a relatively small population, and in comparison to New Zealand, our emissions accounted for in our district are not the largest. But ultimately, when we have it within our capability to do what we can, I think we have a moral obligation to do that. Thank you again to staff, and that's all.
Thank you, Sophie. I'm going to open up to other councillors. Please get your light up if you want to speak, because I'm going to push forward quite quickly. Councillor McCann.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Really good words, Councillor. One of the things that I think we've heard around the table is that while we're not going to make our 2025 target, I know in our briefings as a group, we signalled pretty clearly, I thought, when we were trying to nut out ideas, that we have a desire to be bold rather than take small steps. And that was certainly the discussion that I heard when we were talking about purchasing carbon credits as opposed to actually taking action that can reduce our emissions. So I think there's a significant discussion that this council and the next council have to have about funding these initiatives and making sure that we also get the balance right when we're having significant decisions. And it is very difficult in this space. There are inherent contradictions. And we've heard one at the table today brought up by myself and Councillor Compton about that balance between intensification versus moving out into greenfields and trying to keep trees. There are conflicts in everything that we are discussing, and we need to keep these targets in mind as we make those decisions. And that means that we need to embed climate change into all our thinking, into all our discussions. And as I see the acting CE, I've just taken my glasses off and I can't see him anymore. He's probably there, but it needs to be something that is talked about at all high-level discussions to make sure that we don't miss these things. I do note the conversations around the table about the role that Greater Wellington Regional Council has to play because so much of our emissions are from cars, which leads me on to another topic, is that I did bring up charging stations during the district growth strategy and those general discussions. And the answer was, we're probably not there yet, but we've got to send the signals to developers. We have a developer in the top right-hand corner there of our screen, Mr. Mansell, and I had that discussion with him about whether these ideas were being thought about with developers. And we've got to send the signal that they must be, regardless of whether the legislation enables us to or not, or whether it's appropriate for ideas like that to be in our district plan. If we're not future-proofing our district with all the developments that are occurring now and saying, have you thought about this opportunity? Because it will make a significant difference to our community if people are able to recharge their cars as opposed to buy a petrol or diesel one. So on that great report, I just think there's a lot more we've got to keep doing and keep pushing forward, and that will always be challenging. And a big part of that is bringing the community with us and continuing the story of why we need to play our role. Thank you.
Councillor, you saw the lights just dip there. I think the Chief Executive's just trying to save a little bit of power. Councillor Halliday?
Yes, look, certainly echoing Rob's views there as well. But look, I don't have too much to say, as I know we actually have a champion in the space in our Councillor Sophie Handford, and we're, I think, quite privileged to have her in the space as well, and I wanted to acknowledge that. Also, just building on Councillor Compton's point about wider approach, and also noting Ninka's view on behaviour change, I've said this all along, to me a big ongoing step is for people as individuals taking responsibility of their own footprints. How it impacts and the decisions that the individual makes from a consumer perspective, as well as a guardian of their immediate surroundings. I note the comment of reaching the targets, but we elected to be real about this rather than shelter behind the purchasing of credits or certificates. This echoing back to my previous comment about individual responsibility by all to get to where we need to be. I've found this a very interesting and informative report, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin. I've got Councillor Compton up next, but I do see that Sean's got his hand up. We're in debate, so I'll come back to Sean if I need to. Councillor Compton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First, I think it's really important to acknowledge the work that has taken place in the organisation to get us to this point and to reduce emissions. And, Kapiti, I think, rightfully at the time this was all set in motion, and setting that goal, was a leader in this space. And I think it's really important that we continue to push to be leaders in the space as well. And I think the reason why we managed to get to this point is because we did set an ambitious target, and then the plan was put in place, and then we're focused on implementing it, and now we're getting to the nitty-gritty end of those really difficult bits that we have to make those tough decisions about, where we can't necessarily reduce emissions further because there is a level at which you're always going to have that happen, and you have to make those hard choices about how you offset them. So we're getting to that gritty, difficult choice, and that's a point that the country more broadly will get to a lot further down the path than we are. But, this is why I make no apology for just relentlessly banging the drum about the importance of having a district-wide target in terms of net zero by and I picked 2040 because I want us to be ahead of the rest of the country, because it's always great to win races, and I say that as a runner who in a week and a half time will definitely not win a marathon. But that sort of big, hairy, ambitious goal, it flowed out of the Paris Agreement, which in itself set a big, hairy, ambitious goal of limiting global temperature increase to no more than 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and ideally keeping it to 1.5. Now, as we've seen from the latest IPCC reports, that's looking like an impossible dream right now. But by setting that goal, and our government signing up to it, that has flowed on to the current government setting a goal for us to be net carbon neutral by 2050. Setting that goal has flowed on to them coming up with emissions reduction budgets and now emissions reduction plan, and that's informed where they're spending the revenues that have come in through the emissions trading scheme that's influencing, or hopefully will start to influence, the decisions they make around infrastructure, such as trains to Otaki, please. So it's those big goals and setting them, even if you don't necessarily have the plan in place to achieve them right at the get-go, is hugely important for galvanising efforts. And I know this firsthand from working in the sheep and beef sector. Now, it happened 2 weeks before I started there, but they set a goal. This was before the government even set their goal of the sheep and beef sector being net carbon neutral by 2050, and they led the sheep and beef farmers around the world in doing that. And over the where are we now? We're 2022, so it was about 4 years I've been sort of on and off involved with the sector. That goal has informed everything that organisation has done. It's informed things that all the meat processors do, from their branding to their farm assurance programs. It's flowed through everything they do, and it's only been possible because they set that goal and they're holding themselves accountable to it in terms of measuring the sector's emissions. And to think, just yesterday we had something happen which I don't think anyone thought was politically possible a few years ago, which was to have a proposal to at least put even a nominal price on agricultural emissions that was put forward by the sector. Now, you can debate until the cows come home, pun intended, about the merits of that plan, but that wasn't on the cards 3 or 4 years ago. That was not something anyone thought would politically happen, but here we are. So, I think, as has been mentioned, it's something that should be brought up again at the next long-term plan, and I personally don't think it did get the debate it deserved. I feel like the debate was sort of curtailed or pushed away at the time, but that's politics. Hopefully the next council will get to relitigate that, and I acknowledge the work that Councillor Hanford has done in leading the discussions on that, not just at this table, but actually Aotearoa as a whole. And as Councillor Halliday said, we're very privileged to have her, and actually we're very privileged to have the team that we have here. We might disagree from time to time, but I don't think anyone can doubt their commitment to delivering on the goals that we've got here. So, I guess the challenge that I'll put down to the next council is that, hopefully you will set a big goal and you'll chase it, and you'll hammer government whenever they come and ask what you want investments in your community. And that's, I think, a big challenge going forward, is to make sure that every funding decision that not just we make, but central government makes goes through that lens. And just, I would quickly say to Mark that I can assure him that beyond our finance team and our auditors, no one, or 99.9% of the community don't care how many rates we have and how they're calculated. It's that number on the bottom of the invoice they're worried about.
Thanks, Councillor Compton. Deputy Mayor Janet Holborough.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know if I like using the word hairy, but we did set a big goal 3 years ago when we decided to be carbon neutral by 2025, and since then we've been acting really strongly in this space. But it's not just since then, and I don't know if it was that goal that caused us to do that. I think with councillors like Councillor Hanford around the table and the quality of staff we've got, I think we would be pulling all the levers anyway. But there is an argument that it does encourage action, so I accept that. Councillor Compton talked about what's happened before, and I'd like to kamua kamuri as well, look backward to look forward, and acknowledge the work of those that's been done in the past. Because while this report kind of looks like a new thing, and it is, and it's wonderful that we're talking about what we're doing in the climate space, it does come on the back of a long-standing, strong performance in this space as a council, and the going back to 2011 when we won a Green Award for protecting and enhancing the environment, and there's a whole lot of awards that happened after that. And I remember when after we won one of those awards, Jake Roos, now famous as Lego Master New Zealand, stood in this council chamber and gave the most heartfelt and moving speech on climate change that I think I've ever heard. And he just did so much while he was here, and so I'd particularly like to acknowledge him because he was a real leader in this organisation, in this space. And the mayor at the time, Jenny Rowan, too, and the chair of the Environment Committee at the time, Penny Gaylor, was very strong in that space too. And the work of our youth council and of all of our organisations and the community leaders in this space, particularly Low Carbon Kapiti, who've cheered on and just pushed us and encouraged us, and the other organisations that sit out there in our community as well and encourage us, and also our community leaders in this space, our neighbourhoods who get together and have entered the Green Streets and the Green Neighbourhood Awards. There's so much action that happens in this organisation and in the community. And congratulations on this report today, because it's really good for people to be able to pick up something, have a look. This is what our council is doing, but it's actually the tip of the iceberg in terms of what our community is doing. I should mention our businesses as well in Kapiti who have such a commitment in this space. So thanks for the report. Thanks for your work, Sophie, in this space.
Councillor Pravanov, and then I'm going to go to Councillor Henford for a right of reply.
Through you, Mr. Chair. So I certainly welcome this report, and I think it's really, really important to socialise, the climate action work that we're doing, and it's not only amongst as a council, but also too that our communities know what we're doing, and that they actually understand and also take on board some of the initiatives that are occurring, because it's council is a big player in some respects in this area, but it's also a little player in terms of the people who live here. And so without the whole community on board with this, that our carbon emissions are not going to be reduced greatly. I think it's really important to have a target, because if you don't have a target, you don't have anything to aim for. I think we do need to try really, really hard to meet that, and maybe we've heard quite a few reasons why we haven't reached it, but I think there probably needs to be more conversation around how we can actually achieve those targets. I also agree with Councillor Compton in maybe looking at this as having another type of set of targets that actually relates to the whole district as well, because you can't do things in isolation. You've got to do things together, and strength is it's when you're all joined up. So I welcome this report. It's been great. The conversations that have gone on around this table, it shows that we're all committed to this, and hopefully it sends a message to our communities that this is the way that we must go. Thank you.
All right, Councillor Henford, right of reply.
Yeah, kia ora. I don't feel like I have too much to add to what's already been said. I feel like it's been a really good kind of debate or comment making session. So awesome, as Councillor Pravanov just said, to hear how supportive we all are of being aspirational in this space, because we know how important it is, and how important it is too to provide leadership not only to our community but also to the wider Aotearoa if we have the ability to, which we do, considering the kind of steady footing that we have already in this space. As Councillor Holbrook mentioned, the proven track record that we have to act on the climate crisis, and our ability to, do things quickly and be agile. So I would also like to tautoko everything that Councillor Holbrook said, and acknowledging the groups that have pushed us to continue to do more, and it provides a really awesome mandate, and hopefully we can continue to build kind of that base of the community who are coming forth and saying, yeah, we recognise this is extremely important too. But as mentioned, we need to provide that leadership and be aspirational in doing so. And I think that can look like a myriad of things. And one of those being aspiring for a target date at which we can reach net zero emissions across the district. So looking forward to this being communicated to our wider community, and it's awesome to see councillors on board, and would just like to again thank staff, but I'll leave it there because it's been a very fulsome kōrero.
Thank you, Sophie. So with that, I'm going to put that to the vote. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Against? And that is carried. And just acknowledging the efforts from Linka and Brandy and the team. Certainly I think that is echoed by councillors around the table, the work that you guys do. So look, team, I think we're going to break for lunch. I think we've had a really good crack at it this morning, and we've got still a bit to go. So if that's okay with Dem Services, I think we'll stop, have lunch, and then come back into the meeting. Apologies to staff, they've been waiting, but you probably want lunch as well. So I can see Councillor McCann getting a bit feisty over, he's getting a bit hangry, so.
Excuse me, Mr Chair, we've got Councillor Elliott with a question.
Councillor Elliott, did you have a question?
Not so much a question, Mr Chair, but with your leave, I have to now leave the meeting for the day. And just want to thank you very much and apologise in advance to everyone.
Thanks, Jackie, and thanks for joining us.
See you next time. Bye.
We're going to break for half an hour for those that are online via Zoom. And if you keep your microphone on, you'll hear when we're back in the chambers and getting into it.